Morning. Morning. This is going to be a bit like a Sierra Leone O group with people coming and going all the time and on their telephones, which is cool. I am delighted to be able to introduce the conference. Probably one of my greatest achievements, bizarrely. Actually, it's not one of the greatest honours that I've been awarded was an honorary degree at Salford University. It's the only academic qualification that I've got because I never went to uni. But when they awarded it to me, it meant a huge amount. And so I'm keen to do anything that I can, both for the university and obviously for the veterans community. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to give a sort of introductory context to the conference. I'm then going to hand over to Harry to give a little bit more of a perspective from his perspective, obviously, and then we'll answer questions really on anything you want to. I'm deliberately going to provide a broader context, and I'm going to be a tiny bit provocative. And what I thought I'd start by doing is trying to illustrate in my mind what the veterans' transition journey is, the ex-serviceman and woman's journey from the military into civil life. But I'm going to start by just saying that we're all citizens. We join the military, the services, and get an injection of something, and then we become citizens again. And my central theme is that those citizens who have been injected by the military are really high quality. And the overall message needs to be a message of respect and exploiting potential rather than one of sympathy. And I'll return to that. But on this arrow, you can see if that's everybody who's leaving, there are some who are high quality and highly trained, the signals, the cyber specialists, the officers who've had a lot of leadership and management training, they sit at the top of the arrow. There are then people probably with 8 to 22 years service who have got very good general skills, they're very motivated. You've got a bunch of people probably leaving at about sort of 4 to 8 years who probably don't get the full transition package, but they have got good general skills. They may not have the same levels of motivation. People who've come from relatively socially deprived backgrounds, who have been given an amazing training in the military, who have done service in some very, very challenging circumstances, and then were made redundant in 2014, 2015. These guys have had a taste of life. They have been very well led in the military, but they've probably only got general skills and they then go back into the community. And then you have people who leave who are facing challenges, people who haven't enjoyed it, who've left under a cloud, people who've been injured, people who have challenges that need to be addressed, and they sit at the bottom. They are, and this is anecdotal, they're a relatively small number compared to the whole. So, what happens? The vast majority do okay. The vast majority of people who leave, and this was shown in the Ashcroft study, they do okay. Quite a number, but not as many, actually do amazingly well. Of course, this is oversimplistic, the slide. Of course, they don't all come from that high quality, highly trained area, but for presentational purposes, you can see that the vast majority will. And of those who are facing challenges, and of those who are in that lower bracket that I was talking about, the relatively short service, the people who've only been given general skills, sadly, a number of them become more vulnerable as they go through the transition process. So, what we really need to do is to make sure that there are more of these people. There are more people who do even better than okay, and rather than investing in those who are a high quality bunch who are already being successful, how do we identify the people with general skills who are motivated, who may leave with an aspiration that is limited to be the curator in the local primary school for the rest of their lives, rather than pushing them up so that they become highly motivated and really release their potential. But, of course, on the other side, we have to be extremely careful to make sure that those who are in that general skills area, who get confronted by challenges, very often social challenges or economic challenges, don't fall down into the vulnerable category. Now, if you look at that very oversimplistic model, at the moment, I feel that society concentrates far too much on the lower bracket, the vulnerable bracket, and the high quality, highly trained bracket, and not enough on that central area and the people who sit on the interfaces. Because investment there is the investment that will really increase the capacity of ex-servicemen and women to contribute to society in the way that they can. And I'll just go through a number of headlines, just to expand on that a little bit. The first is, there is a huge amount of anecdotal evidence. Huge amount of anecdote, but it's anecdotal. And there is also evidence presented by people who, quite rightly, have a reason to highlight certain aspects of the transition journey. My brother is the chief executive of a charity called Walking with the Wounded. He will promote in his publicity those things that support that charity. They won't necessarily, they may inspire people through seeing how the wounded can actually do amazing things, but they won't present the narrative for the middle category that I showed on that diagram. This narrative of real potential from people who have skills that can be exploited when they get into civilian life. So we need, in my view, the Ashcroft study had some objective evidence, but we have set up to try to get real evidence-based research. A thing called the Armed Forces Covenant and Transition Review, and Peter Benesch was going to come and talk to you later on today. Sadly, he's ill and is unable to. But this is an attempt to get some proper evidence-based research that will demonstrate exactly where the challenges are, exactly where the opportunities are, and allow us to present objective conclusions that will, I believe, slightly change the way people think about this challenge. My second point I've already touched on is I asked the question whether the public is being sympathetic or respectful. If you read the Armed Forces Covenant language, it's patronising. It's about, our servicemen mustn't be unfairly treated. It's about how they've served their country. I mean, yes. Everybody knows that. I worry a bit that the whole momentum behind the Armed Forces Covenant misrepresents what we should be doing, which is to say this is an amazing resource. It's worth exploiting it. But we've got to make sure that some people who've been through extremes are properly looked after. But the general sentiment in it I find rather nauseating. Now, there'll be lots of people here who think what I'm saying is horrifying. And of course, having it is better than not having anything at all, so it's a progression. But I think we need to be really careful that the tone, the public tone of sympathy and pity is moderated, and that we start to drive a much more forceful narrative that respects what these men and women have done and are therefore demonstrating they're capable of doing in the future. My point on the veteran's journey, the ex-service man and woman, the former service man and woman, I think we're the only country whose MOD is responsible for coordinating the veteran's journey. Now, there will be people in this room who know how powerful the Department for Health is, how powerful work and pensions are, how powerful DCLG is, and how relatively lacking in power the Cabinet Office is, in the way that we run our government structure. And when you look at the veteran's journey, there are, for sure, employment issues in it, but there are social and economic issues, more general social and economic issues in it, which touch many other government departments. And it seems strange to me that the veterans' journey is coordinated by the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence is a department that we want to concentrate on keeping the country safe. It's a department that has expertise in that area. Intergovernmental departmental relationships are cumbersome, to say the least, in the British system. And it feels to me as if there should be better cross-government coordination of the veterans' interests. Now, I am not contradicting what I've just said, because I think that will exploit the potential of this resource much better. But it will also make sure that those who need to be looked after are better cared for. I absolutely understand that with a National Health Service, we're not going to do the same sort of thing that people do in America. And indeed, something like the Department for Veterans Affairs has had huge challenges. So that is not what I'm proposing. But I am suggesting that we would do well to look at structures like Canada, Australia, where they appoint ministers, or even, dare I say it, Scotland, where the Scottish Government have appointed one of their ministers as being responsible for veterans in Scotland. So, is the veterans' journey properly coordinated at the highest level? My view is that it's not, and it should be improved. And I think that leads on to my next point. Does the government really take its responsibility seriously? And I think the two things that bother me are that the things that spike tend to be the things that are politically sensitive at the time. So look at the wording of the Armed Forces Covenant, look at where the majority of activity takes place. I mean, if government wants to have a go at industry to get them to employ people more, they will have a conversation with the usual suspects, the Jaguar Land Rovers, the BTs, these people who tend to take recruits out of that top band of my arrow. Where it's much, much more complicated is to talk to SMEs in the northwest or the northeast. Not much of that going on, but it could be if government was really taking its responsibility seriously. I've seen organisations like Business in the Community do a considerable amount because they believe it's the right thing to do with SMEs, which I think should be led by that part of government that has responsibility for employment and work. Are we set to look after our veterans in the longer term? I think I'm better leaving Harry to talk about this. But I'll just one anecdote. When my regiment was getting a serious kicking in Afghanistan in about 2009, we as a regiment took some decisions about how we were going to look after our wounded and the families of the fallen. And so we invested our own regimental money in looking after these people because we had more than we expected, and we found our regimental system wasn't able to cope. In doing that, we identified a guy who had been injured in a bomb in Northern Ireland in, I think, 1984, 1985. And he'd had his legs blown off. And he had never progressed beyond the stubbies, the low leg, the small legs. He got lost from us, from a regimental family, and had never really progressed. And he was part of an old war. And we were able to, thank God, and it was all quite embarrassing actually when we reviewed how we had not been looking after him properly. We were able to bring him back into the system and make sure he got the very best of contemporary care. Now, what's going to be happening to people like Harry in 2030? When we've completely changed our attitudes? You know, it's very difficult to predict what's going to be happening in the next 2 weeks, let alone the next 10 years. But attitudes will have changed. Afghanistan will be a dim and distant memory. We will have reconciled it somehow in our memories, and the thing that tends to get pushed under the radar is the debris and the sadness. So actually, we've given ourselves some real responsibility out into the very long term. And it's different to World War II and World War I, particularly World War II, because this has not been a war of national survival. So it's not embedded in the country's psyche like the Second World War was. So the Second World War veteran can go to Normandy in June every year, have a ceremony, the Queen will come to it. This is in the public consciousness. Afghanistan's not going to be. So how do we make sure that we look after veterans in the long term? And I'll leave Harry to talk a bit about some of the rather more technical medical stuff that's going on, but it's terribly serious. Important, not serious, both. I've alluded to this. This is about too much time looking at the usual suspects. I think we congratulate. If you talk to people who are doing transition, I don't know if there are any people from the MOD who are responsible for resettlement here and career transition. The statistics that we're given tend to be statistics that are based on people getting a job, not people getting a good job. And the energy tends to go to where it's easiest. So signals technician, cyber specialist, these will get jobs. A pilot, these guys get jobs. Conversations with big firms in London, I'm delighted I'm talking in Manchester. Conversations with big firms in London are London-centric. They have that mindset. We have got to talk to other people, not just to the usual suspects. And the same thing applies to the charitable sector. We've got to broaden our perspectives. And I'm going to leave you with a point on that. Now, ultimately, my rather sort of crude conclusion is that for transition, and this is an easy thing to say, and I'll then leave, we need to change the concept of transition from a Victorian-based patronising push to a socially astute, technically driven pull system. And by that, simplistically, I mean at the moment we take a person who's leaving the military, and when they get to within 6 months, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit, when they get to 6 months from leaving, we start giving them some training and we shove them out into the job market and put them on the supermarket shelf and wait for somebody to come and buy them. We haven't had a conversation with the customer in the supermarket about the training that person should have, but we've given them some advice on what we think might suit them. So we do that. And if you're a bit nervous because you've been sitting inside a very patriarchal system, very, very tight system, and you don't quite know what's going to happen in that world out there, you're going to take safe options. The alternative seems to me to be to have a technology-based solution which starts with the requirements, starts with the business, and puts its tentacles right out into the military structures, and starts training people, if I was being really contentious, before they join. So as they come into the military system, the training that they're getting as they go through it is both good for the military and good for the future. and is probably patronised by somebody who's going to pull them out and employ them in the long term. And you change your whole concept. You realise, if you're in the MOD, that you own a valuable resource that has a value. Why the hell are we spending something like £10 million a year on transition when the product, the thing that we're giving to society, has huge value associated with it? So what I'd like to do, if one could, would be to change the whole approach so that rather than bunging people out, you draw them out when they're ready with the necessary basic skills which can then be developed by the business that they go into. And clearly that needs much thought, but I hope that the point that I make is clear. The final sort of thing, that's the charitable environment that we operate in today. And these guys are wonderful. I mean, they do amazing things. They do them for that little bit at the bottom on my slide. And their narrative, their sound, their publicity is very, very loud. I mean, the transformation that Help for Heroes gave the sector during Afghanistan, Iraq and Afghanistan was amazing. I mean, it had a huge impact on the public's understanding of what we were doing and what we were. But was it necessarily a good impact? Has it distorted the way people feel? Is the conversation today going to be about how do we help these poor people? Or is the conversation today going to be about these guys are great and we need them, and they do need to look after the people at the bottom, and they need to look after the long term, they need to be in for the long haul. So a charity that has a policy that it spends every penny that it gets and it doesn't have a war chest is a charity that we should be looking in the eye and saying, you need to have a war chest because we need to have things that are ready for the future. We need to talk to the Charity Commission and to all these people who judge charities' performance on how small their reserves are. In this field, there is a really clear justification for a reserve. But I digress. My point is that this is great, but it is partial and it is risky, but it is shaping too much the way people think. Now, I'm now going to make an unashamed plug, because I'm the chair of a charity called Team Rubicon UK. I mean, it's a global charity. It's come from the States. It's called Team Rubicon. I chair the UK bit. This is a charity that sends former servicemen and women to assist with disaster relief around the world and humanitarian support. It exploits the amazing skills of the military, and it takes them out and helps people who are in real trouble. And it won't surprise you to know that it is an extraordinary success. It has just sent people out to Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the serious flooding that they had. They'd been in southern Sri Lanka building bridges in a community that got cut off, and houses of people who, with the locals, people who'd been had their houses destroyed. And you bring together mainly ex-military, some firefighters, some paramedics, but you bring them together in teams for short periods to help others, and remarkably, no, not remarkably, it's obvious, these guys are extraordinary in chaotic situations, living out of backpacks, doing things for other people. Now, I don't promote it, except on occasions like this, as being a charity that has a double benefit. But clearly, the double benefit is that these guys get a huge amount by coming back into a team and doing something with a sense of purpose. And we've seen, by going and doing this stuff, how good it is for the people who've left the army or the navy or wherever the services, who have lost that sense of team and may have lost that sense of purpose. Now, for me, this sort of charity, this positive, outward-looking charity for all that combines people with other guys in civil society who are up for it, is the sort of area that we should really be promoting and helping. And that I do give money to, but that's not my point. My point is that you look at the balance, and the balance, in my view, is wrong. So have I filled up enough time for you only to talk for 2 minutes?
All right, yeah.
I'm going to hand over to Harry now to to just talk a bit about, to probably disagree with everything that I've said and talk a bit about his stuff. Harry, he's got a CV. He went to Falmouth College of Art after school and then told me completely out of the blue that he was going to join the Royal Marine, which came as a bit of a shock to us because we thought he was going to be sort of smelling funny things. Anyway, he passed into the Royal Marines, but because they didn't like the date, he didn't like the date that they had offered him to start because he wanted to go on a tour of India. He decided to go to RCB, got into the army. They gave him a later joining date so he could do his India tour, and he ended up joining the army. He served for 5 years? 4 years?
8 years.
8 years. Served for 8 years. Served for 8 years. Was in Basra Palace when they withdrew from Basra Palace in Iraq. And then went out to Afghanistan, was wounded in Afghanistan in 2009. And so is now a successful author with a bunch of books in that suitcase for anybody who wants to buy them. He might be too embarrassed to say, but successful author and father and with one on the way. So for us, this is an amazing story. We are very lucky, but he does represent a very particular part of the veteran community.
So I'm as Dad said, I'm the anecdotal, and I'll try and I was a trustee for Walking with the Wounded for a while, so I've seen some of the issues that spread not just from the very seriously injured, but I know I'll be coming from that perspective. I think to start with, I just want to talk about, I sort of was thinking about it in terms of two spectrums. The first spectrum is the sort of spectrum of injury, where I sit down one end, and the second spectrum is sort of education, training, and the ability to withstand the shocks of life. So those are the two spectrums. In the first spectrum, that sort of injury, I was one of those 800 people who were aeromedded from Afghanistan back to the UK and had life-changing injuries. Not all of those 800 had life-changing injuries, but that's the sort of cohort of people who suffered injuries that meant that they probably wouldn't be able to serve on. What I find interesting about being down that end is that I went into a very, very long decompression. And I said 8 years, actually. I did serve for 4 years as a soldier who could serve effectively on the front line. And then I had another 4 years when I went off and did a series of desk jobs while I was rehabilitating. I'm the most visible, along with, I suppose, half of that 800. But that's not to say that somebody who'd stand up here, and I know people who look, people look at them, they look absolutely fine, but I know I wouldn't change my injuries with them because they're in constant pain because of some injury to their nerves. So I know that it's not just about that visibility, and there's people who weren't injured at all who will slide up and down that scale depending on their mental health as well. So it's definitely a spectrum that is very wide and complicated. I think waking up in Birmingham, which isn't when you're after injured, it's where the hospitals were, was not some sort of purgatory. Waking up in Birmingham, and I can remember one of my earliest thoughts that I can remember, obviously there's lots of drugs involved and a sort of coming out of being sedated, but one of my first thoughts was, what am I going to do now? And being able to think that was partly because of where I'd come from. And I know that a lot of the people in the bays around me wouldn't have been thinking that. A lot of them, with no legs, would have been thinking, and you could hear them, when can I get back out and get my sniper rifle again, even though the guy only had one arm left. And in that year to 3 years, I think, of decompression from injury, you go through loss. You go through those things: the loss of a limb, the loss of the ability to be part of a group that you were in, and I felt this. So the day that I went to the medals parade and I looked at the people marching off the square was the day that I realised that I couldn't be part of that band of brothers, even though at the time there was a slight sense that we should hold on to everyone, and I was doing a job as a 2IC. I mean, it's one of the most grim things I've ever done, is to go and sit in an office and watch everyone go and do PT and know that I could never do that. And the army learned, I think, and the military learned that actually the idea of holding on to people was pretty quickly was seen as a bad thing. But I think it's just worth noting that that's where we started from, that there was this idea that we're going to have a few injured, we should hold on to them. But the problem just escalated, and we had far more injured than we could cope with, but also that wasn't the best way of dealing with people. So that's the first spectrum, is that spectrum of injury. The second spectrum is the education. I mean, I came from a place where I'd been to university, I had a loving family, and I could build on that education after I was injured. The first thing I said was, right, what am I going to do? I'm going to do a master's. What am I going to do it in? Oh, I'll do it in international security. And within 2 years, I was at King's doing a master's, and the army had paid for me to do that. But I had to fight pretty hard, and I had to work the system at the time. So I'm still the anecdotal. Hopefully, this will start to be a bit more relevant to the wider issues soon. And that point about family is so important. I mean, I look across at one of the riflemen opposite me, who was 18 years old. They'd been at Catterick, and then 4 weeks later, they'd come and joined my company in Afghanistan, and they'd come later because they weren't 18 yet. And they few GCSEs to their name, and within 4 weeks of being in Afghanistan, they'd lost both legs. They were then in a bed opposite me with their mum, who wasn't together with their father, coming at different times, and immediately you could see the tensions, the arguments, the girlfriend who was causing dramas, and there was me on the other side of the room with a very loving, close family. And I'm not saying their family wasn't loving, I'm just saying that it's a very different place to come from when you're injured. So this second spectrum of education, I suppose what I mean is that I had all that in place. So I come from one end of the injured spectrum, very seriously injured, and then on the education spectrum, I come from the other end. I have every possibility of going forward and being an asset to society. I think with the injured, and I talked about holding on to people, it's one of those things I've seen is that there's a sense that the army, charities, regimental groups should hold on to people. And I do think that's a good thing. We should give people a network, an environment in which they can feel part of a team. But it can't be the only thing if you want people to transition into society. They need to be able to go back and find new groups of people at work, new friends, new hobbies. You can see where it worked really well with the Guinea Pig Club from the Second World War. These were the pilots who were burned and had massive facial reconstruction. They would meet once a year, and then they'd go back into society and to do what they did. But there wasn't a group that held on to them and stopped them from reaching their potential. And I think so. The second sort of, having spoken about those two spectrums, the second thing I want to talk about is the sort of where you come at transition from. Are you talking about trying to make soldiers an asset to society? Is that the outcome you want? Or are you creating a group of people who can just withstand the shocks of life? Bringing them up so they're able to be part of society. And some people at the bottom of the arrow, you're trying to bring them up so they can go through life and withstand all those shocks. But most of the people, as Dad was saying, is to get them up into that area where they can be an asset. And the point's been made, I think, that more could be done to change the narrative on that. And I don't agree with everything he was saying about charities. I think the problem is when the message goes from the charity out into the public, it's still one of the victim. And as a soldier who's been injured, I hate that. A lot of the charities are dealing with a across the spectrum. It's just that often when it gets into the public domain, what seems to raise the money is the sort of sympathy victim narrative. So it's a difficult balance to make. I think transition, one thing I say, and Dad also alludes to, is that my transition started with my education even before I joined the army, even before I thought about joining the army. It allowed me to go all the way through and build on those skills. And even though when you see those adverts, and I saw one the other day that talked about the fact that you could learn to be an electrician in the army, and this was something that was going to make you more employable. My experience of being a platoon commander is that the sorts of courses that my soldiers were doing weren't actually that transferable. There was a little bit of a myth in that, and that more could be done actually within the army to take more risk actually within the military. And I know it's something that's very hard to influence from the outside, but if the military was taking risks and saying we're going to train these people properly, and even if we lose some to the job the secondment we've made to BT or another company, even if we lose them at the end of the year or at the end of their training program, in the long run, having people who have skills that they could use outside and who are invested in something outside the military will be a good thing for the military. I want to talk a little bit about the transition that I've seen from my sort of cohort. The people who have left the army and gone into things like the Olympics, and it's just an example, but the Paralympics. I've seen a lot of people who have trained for the Paralympics and just not quite got there. And I'm not somebody who doesn't think people should do those things. I just think it's something to be aware of. There was a sort of push that we can replace something that they've lost, something physical. And you say something, well, you've lost your legs, maybe you could be in the skiing Olympics or you could run at the Olympics. And then the reality hits that there's 4 or 5 years of hard training, and lo and behold, there's a load of other people who've been disabled since they were born, or who've been trying this, or are just better athletes, and people don't quite make it. And I'm not saying people shouldn't be given those opportunities. I just think that there's a potential for a series of cliffs, such as the cliff that you get when you leave the army, that you just prolong a cliff if you keep trying those sorts of short to medium term fixes. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense. And I think we should all be aware that those cliffs will keep happening unless we do the top of the arrow and start making sure people are an asset to society rather than. I hope I make sense. I just want to talk briefly at the end about the sort of medical transition for me, and I know I'm a particular case, and because I'm so visible, actually, I'm the case that probably won't be allowed to fail, because it would be too politically difficult if people like me turn up in the Sun saying, I'm not being looked after. And you've seen that since the injuries have happened. There's people who go on into the media saying, I haven't been looked after properly. And it's not good enough. But it's also not always completely the truth of what's going on. So the NHS, when I was leaving Headley Court and the rehabilitation centre within the military, I sort of really wanted the NHS to work. I was a bit of a believer in it. I felt that was where we should be put, because I thought it would be good that we were looked after with the rest of society for all the other reasons that I've talked about, rather than being kept separate. But after four years in the NHS, I must say I really hunger after being able to just go somewhere like Headley Court and being dealt with in a more efficient manner, because all the inefficiencies of the NHS apply to soldiers no matter what the Covenant says, no matter what the Murison report says. There's still the inefficiencies that mean that my care at the prosthetic centre that I'm at has been really quite choppy, and so I've changed my mind. If somebody said to me, would you like to go back to Headley? Yes, please, send me there now. It would save me going back and forth, and I think the main problem that I can identify is one of actually communication, the ability that I had at Headley Court to just email my prosthetist and say, yeah, I'm coming in, these are the things that I need doing, so that he can email me and say, don't come in yet, we haven't got the kit. The problem with NHS is you can't do that, so you go in and there's no kit, and you just spend 4 hours in the car. That's another anecdote, but I hope that gives a feeling of the one end of the spectrum, and I think it probably applies across anyone who's a veteran who then falls further down the spectrum of being injured, whether it's mental or physical. And recently a piece of shrapnel in my arm suddenly decided to flare up. It's odd, you think you're all fixed and you're just going to crack on for the rest of your life, and then something happens, and I suppose it's the anxiety of it more than what happened. My arm went a bit red, and when you've had lost a leg through infection or something, when something flares up in your arm, you just think, oh, I don't want to lose another one. So and I went to my GP and said, I've got this lump, it really bloody hurts. Can you take it out? He said, no, I can't take it out. But I suppose my point is that although I was given a scan and the GP said, yeah, we'll put you on we'll refer you to a surgeon, there was no one who because I just want to get on with my life, I hadn't been following the developments that happened in the NHS. I didn't know that there was a thing called the Veterans Trauma Network. I had to do a bit of emailing around. It took a few days, and then I was into this thing, which is a network around the army, around the NHS. Sorry. But the impression I got was that there were a few of these little sort of cottage industries, and I think the Veterans Trauma Network is sort of the most established. But there were a couple of other options as well, and I suppose it was the anxiety I had with something happening to me, and then going out into a huge organisation like the NHS and trying to know where I should have gone. In my opinion, what should have happened, and it sort of comes a little bit sort of the push-pull thing. But I should have got to my GP, and he plugged in my NHS number, and a box should have flashed up. And I know, IT is difficult, but this is the Veteran Trauma Network, and I would have been immediately into some sort of system rather than the other way, rather than the user having to know where to go. So I think that's all I'll say really about the NHS and my medical recovery, but that's the most recent thing that's happened to me, and then sort of in a physical recovery, that's where I'm most worried, both about sort of prosthetics in the next 20 years, but also about suddenly things flaring up. So yeah, and the last thing I'd like to say is, and I think Team Rubicon sort of shows it, that a lot of the charities that do that take veterans and do something active, whether it's putting them into jobs or doing expeditions or helping as an NGO, it's that purpose. It's giving people a purpose. The Paralympics will do it for a bit. A charity might do it for a bit. Team Rubicon might do it for one summer when there's a disaster. But it's giving veterans a purpose so that they are part of society, I think, and it's the education and training that will really do that thing. Sorry, a bit of a waffle, but those are my anecdotal thoughts, and hopefully some of them will be relevant to, yeah. So the advanced study, has anyone heard of the advanced study? Anyone at all? So the advanced study is just on the cohort that were aeromedded, so the 800 seriously injured, and it's been set up at Headley Court, although it's not owned there. And essentially what they're trying to do is get 600 of that 800 group to do tests on the first, third, 5, and then every 5 years after that, to try and get a cohort study, we call it, of what happens to injured people. Because no one really knows what happens to somebody who's been blown up, or someone who's been in a bomb, and all the things it can do to them over the years. Even the studies from Vietnam are slightly different. And critically, people who've been brought back to life, the unexpected survivors, which there's quite a number. What happens to someone who's been resuscitated 5, 10 times, 20 years down the line? What are their medical outcomes like? And then they're taking 600 soldiers who weren't injured but are of similar age, and they're going to map these two groups over each other. And it's just, I suppose it's important to know about if you're interested in the bit of the most broken people, because it will give hopefully give a more medical and scientific research-based evidence of what happens to